Well, thank you. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to take part in this important project. I'm especially pleased to collaborate with Ana Covarrubias, who is with us today, my colleague and collaborator from the Colegio de Mexico, and with whom I've written several joint papers, and we have a book of mine that is being revised with Ana's participation that should be published sometime in the fall. So it's a great pleasure to have her here and to be able to salute her and thank her for her contributions. So what I'm going to try to do today is offer some projections or guesses about trends in U.S. Mexico relations over the coming 25 years or so. This is guesswork, right? This is not exactly scientific analysis, but it is based on projections from the analyses that Ana and I have been making about U.S.-Mexican relations in the past year or so, and which will continue to be published over the coming year or so. We actually have a joint essay together in your marvelous book on the future of U.S.-Mexico relations, and that's kind of a starting point for my conversation here and for the collaboration that I hope will continue with us. So, as we look ahead for the next quarter century, let us say, what do I think we're going to see? Well, the first thing I think we're going to see is continuity. And some of the continuity is analytical or conceptual. I think, for example, that the asymmetry in the U.S.-Mexico relationship that people have noted over the last 50 or 100 years is going to continue. It might change in its magnitude in one direction or the other, but the United States is going to be larger and stronger and more prosperous, and Mexico will continue to grow in its different directions, but nonetheless, by the end of a quarter century, I suspect that asymmetry will still be a defining characteristic of the relationship. Now, what are the components of this asymmetry, and how might we analyze them? In the economic realm, for example, I suspect that the manufacturing capacity of Mexico will grow. It will become a more industrialized and technologized society, that it will still occupy a position somewhere in the gap between the third world and the first world, but I think it will move closer to the first world, and its economy is going to change accordingly, and it's going to drive that transition toward a new economic future for Mexico. So if we look at Mexico as becoming a center, especially in the Western Hemisphere, of manufacturing and technological innovation, we can also anticipate that there will be nationalistic pressures, not only from other countries of Latin America, but especially from the United States. Now, I disagree with Donald Trump on just about everything he says, but he does represent a kind of bedrock of nationalism and uncertainty, and in some degrees fear, in the United States. So as Mexico grows and becomes stronger, I think in some ways, at least from the standpoint of Trump followers, that's going to be a source of concern. And there may well be pockets of industry in which industry already, has moved in part to Mexico. We might anticipate more of that. I anticipate also that some production capacity of Mexico will move into the United States. And in this sense, there will be greater integration between the economies. But I think integration does not necessarily mean harmony. It may well lead to conflict, especially in specific sectors. So the general prediction that I make about the economic relationship over the next 20, 25 years is that it will exhibit growth in both countries, but it will also be accompanied by conflict as well as cooperation. I do not see necessarily a solely harmonious economic future to be shared by the two countries, but I do think that there will be substantial growth and development in both countries. I would suspect a greater degree of development in Mexico than in the United States, which is sort of maxed out on its development. And that in this sense, there might well be certainly pockets of collaboration and cooperation, maybe more than there are now. But I anticipate that that will be accompanied also by pockets of economic conflict. Secondly, in the social realm, I anticipate, as many analysts have said, that the middle class in Mexico will grow. I do not accept the current figures that many people provide, that it's like 40%. I think that's an exaggeration. Nonetheless, it all depends on how you define the classes. You know, the social class structure. I mean, you could define classes in such a way that, you know, Mexico has an enormous middle class, and you could define classes in such a way as that Mexico has a relatively reduced middle class. A lot depends on the analytical definition, and I do not know of a consensus in this realm. But I think that there will be an expansion of groupings and sectors in the middle, put it that way, and that this will lead to further and be accompanied by, and as a result of increased and extended development within Mexico. It is also possible that this will be accompanied by greater movement and mobility of productive sectors of Mexico into the United States, and in fact, possibly more movement and mobility toward Mexico as well. That is, my guess is that there will be more mobility in both directions in terms of economic production and cooperation, and that this can have very positive results, but it can also lead to conflict and uncertainty on both sides. So I think the way that the political community is able to respond to these economic and social alterations and changes is going to define the political nature of the relationship. Now, to look at the politics, and more the politics than the diplomacy of the relationship. I mean, it seems to me that the task of diplomacy is to try to remove politics from the relationship. It never works that way, but that's what diplomats tell us they're trying to do. Now, let's take a look at things from a distance. That both countries have democratic systems, generally speaking, of a presidentialist variety, with direct elections of presidents. Mexico has more functional political parties than the United States. I would not be terribly surprised if there were not more breakaway parties or political sectors in the United States. So we might be likely to move in the direction of a multi-party system rather than the two-party system that we generally have. That is pure speculation, but on the other hand, that is the characterization of all my remarks here. But let's anticipate that there might well be a multi-party system in the United States. And if you look at the agitation the United States has undergone over racial and other issues, it's hard to see that only two parties are going to be able to accommodate and represent all of the competing sectors in the United States. And I'm not sure what the configuration of other parties is going to be, but I would not be at all surprised to see breakaway parties from the Republicans, who really ought to have a breakaway party, and the Democrats, who at least at the moment are struggling very hard to maintain unity in the face of the upcoming election. But that is such a struggle to maintain unity is a sign that there are internal within party pressures that might lead to breakaway movements in both. Generally speaking, I think both countries are going to continue to show formal features of political democracy, however, with embedded authoritarian features. I mean, it's not going to be a pure, limpieza democrática in both countries. That what we're going to see is a kind of checkerboard of democratic and authoritarian politics. And I anticipate this will be likely to emerge in both countries, not just in specific regions in the United States. I think it's going to be across the board. I mean, who might have thought that there would be tensions in, say, South Carolina and in Minnesota at the same time? I mean, politics are becoming nationalized in the United States. They are less regionalized than they have been. And if you look at the whole logic of the federal structure, it was based on regionalism. And that is shifting. It's not clear to me exactly how it's going to go, but it seems to me that that is going to lead to new configurations of politics, new forms of representation, opportunities for currently submerged groups in the United States to find effective representation, and also in Mexico. I mean, I think also that the leadership of AMLO in Mexico is now very ambivalent, certainly has authoritarian features, and could spark, breakaways in a number of different directions. We've been talking about, the breakaway of the breakup of the PRI for the last generation, and it seems somehow to congeal itself again with the PRI and the PAN in top. But I think that is going to change. That is going to have to change within Mexico, and I would not be surprised if there emerged even greater than there are at the present protest movements against AMLO's style of ruling and some of the decisions that he's making, not only in the domestic arena, but also in regard to foreign policy. I mean, who would have thought that the president of Mexico would go to such great lengths to align himself with Donald Trump? I mean, it's absolutely an unbelievable, bewildering development. But nonetheless, there are, of course, similarities between AMLO and his style of rule and Donald Trump and his style of rule. This is a dangerous guess, I think, that his calculation that he's making, because if we imagine that some leader like Joseph Biden might become the president of the United States, that changes the equation entirely. The kind of look-alike politics, look-alike from Mexico toward Trump under AMLO are going to be totally outdated and counterproductive, it seems to me, for Mexico. And it's going to be interesting to see how the two governments get along, that is AMLO and Biden, if that is the outcome. It's not going to be straightforward and easy, and AMLO is going to have to explain his behavior over the last couple of years, not only to Mexican citizens, but also to politicians in the United States. That's going to be an interesting kind of challenge for him. Turning to a different matter, I suspect that we will see an increase of native-born Mexicans living in the United States. I suspect that that might have significant impact within regions, but across the country, I think it will be a relatively modest change. It's not clear what first or second generation Mexican in the United States are going to do in politics. My guess, is that they might be more inclined to align with the Democratic Party, but you never can tell. But that's going to be an interesting thing. I do not think they will have a major instantaneous political impact. I rather doubt that we'll see a unified voto mexicano in the United States within the next 10 or 15 years. It might emerge later on, but I don't think that's going to happen in the very near future. It would lead, however, the increase of Mexican mobility to the United States, an increase in the importance of the Southwest in the United States. I think it's going to lead to an increase in attention to the border in the United States, and my personal hope is that leaders at the border on both countries will try to govern the border and not leave it to the politicians in Washington, D.C. Or in Mexico City. Let the border govern itself and look for ways to sort of accommodate the pressures and the opportunities that the juxtaposition of Mexico and the United States affords. A lot of people think of the border as a kind of bridge or a fence between Mexico and the United States. You could also think of it as a bridge, as a point of connection and an opportunity for leaders of both countries. Let me just look, if I might, to partisan developments in the short term in both countries. Obviously, AMLO still has several years to go in his presidency, but given the possibility of a transition from Donald Trump to Joseph Biden, I say possibility, even if by some means or another Biden wins the election, if you simply go by the counting of votes, that is imminent, that doesn't mean the story is over. Trump is going to contest it. He's going to challenge it. He's going to say it was rigged. You know, the other day he recently said he's going to deserve a third term as president in the United States. Oh, my Lord, give us a break. But nonetheless, that is what he said. And he shows no sign that he's going to be willing to leave office if he's voted, if the vote comes out against him. I mean, it's going to be a real challenge for the U.S. political system. And ironically, it makes us, look more like some troubled nations of Latin America than we used to think. I mean, this will be a kind of an interesting thing for Latin American specialists to analyze as we look at the president who is voted out of office but refuses to leave. What happens then, and who are the deciders, and how are they empowered to decide what is supposed to happen? This also, however, the imminence, if it is true, of a Biden victory poses really great challenges for AMLO in Mexico. I mean, he went so far above board to identify himself with Donald Trump that I think that's going to weaken the Mexican hand, at least so long as he's in office for quite some time in its negotiations with the United States. Now, Biden is not someone to hold grudges or to punish people or seek revenge or anything like that, but I just think it's going to be much harder for Mexico to press cases for its interests in negotiations with the United States, given the fact that López Obrador has thrown his lot in so completely with Donald Trump. Now, other Mexican politicians may not agree with what he did, but nonetheless, he did do it, and it's going to be hard to live down, especially given the nature of concentrated presidentialism in Mexico. That is, it's one thing for, a senator in the United States to challenge the United States. The system works quite differently, at least in my experience, in Mexico. So we'll have to wait and see what the outcome here is. But nonetheless, so the future is one of uncertainty. I think that the economic profile in the relationship is, to me, relatively clear. That shows you how little I know about economics. But nonetheless, I think that the possibilities of economic collaboration and cooperation are substantial. There might be conflict within specific industries. But nonetheless, I think that the prospects for economic cooperation are pretty good between the two countries. In the social area, I think that there will be continued Mexican migration. I don't think it's going to cause a great reaction, negative reaction in the United States. There are parts of the United States that have very heavy concentrations of Mexican populations, and they're doing very well, thank you, for people who thought otherwise. I think the issues ahead are political. The contentious issues ahead are political, and that is going to depend on the calculations that political leaders make on one side or the other, and the kinds of interaction that might develop. I will simply say that López Obrador, in my view, made a substantial miscalculation in putting himself so much aligned with Donald Trump. But on the other hand, the question is whether the aftermath of that is relatively short-lived or not. I think there will be a period of time in which it's kind of difficult to carry on normal, quote, historical negotiations as in the past. But my guess would be that in 5 years or so, especially after Lopez Obrador leaves office, that the opportunities for U.S. Mexico diplomatic collaboration will expand as well. So it's a mixed bag. There are a number of variables to take into account, but it seems to me that clearly the relationship is multifaceted. It's going to stay multifaceted. It's going to have a lot of sidebars and dimensions to it. But just to come back to my central point here, I do think that asymmetry is going to continue to be a major feature of the relationship. And the question is how political leaders on both sides try to manage that. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I will now invite Ana Covarrubias from El Colegio de Mexico, who co-authored with Peter. Ana, what do you think is going to happen in the next 20 years or so, if you can look that far?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I really have little to add to what Peter just said, but there are perhaps a few points that I would like to underline. The first is we all predicted that with AMLO coming to power, relationships, the bilateral relationship was going to be very bad because we would have a so-called leftist president with a very nationalistic president in the United States, who is Trump. And in the end, what we ended having was a very nationalistic president in the United States and a non-nationalistic president in Mexico. So there was in addition to the similarities that Peter has just said between the two in terms of how they govern and how they are, what we have then is a very surprising understanding, a personal understanding, which is not new in Mexico-U.S. relations, but it is very surprising that it is a personal understanding based on a very extreme pragmatism, which is what Peter said, referring to López Obrador saying yes to all U.S. demands. This is not new in Mexico-U.S. relations, but at least in the past, negotiations were behind the scenes. And there was a formality, or there was an image of nationalism from the Mexican side. And we're not having that this time, which is, I think, something different or unique. So what I would say is, well, about nationalism, that's one point. And the other point is relates to diplomatic collaboration. What we're also seeing is that there are no foreign policy subjects in which Mexico and the U.S. either coincide or completely diverge. Foreign policy now, I mean, diplomatic relations, or what is happening in the world, is not at all a content in Mexico-U.S. relations these days. And this is very surprising. The U.S. has, its foreign policy, Mexico has its own foreign policy, and there are no points of coincidence or divergence, or if they are, like we are witnessing in the inter-American system, they're not relevant. So I think that's another thing that we have to underline. In terms of how I see the relationship in the next 25 years, I would agree completely with Peter. I think the defining characteristic, which is asymmetry, will remain, will be there. And my impression is that Mexico will become an even more vulnerable and weak partner because of the social conditions, inequality, polarization, the economic crisis, which we are now living, and which is supposedly getting worse after the pandemic, if the pandemic ends at some point in time. So I think that we will probably become a weaker and a more vulnerable partner. And what that means is that we will have to either more pragmatic and then see how we understand with the United States, or we will have to return to previous foreign policy positions in terms of we can disagree with the United States, but the United States should not intervene in Mexico. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and perhaps Jorge Schiavone is going to elaborate more on this, is that what is also interesting now, and I don't know whether this will continue to be the case in the next 25 years, is that Trump gives the impression that he doesn't care about the long-standing U.S. priority in Mexico, which is stability. The United States was willing to accept anything from Mexico as long as the government in Mexico maintained stability. And now we have a very divided society, a very weak economy, very polarized positions, and violence and organized crime and insecurity, public insecurity, which is widespread. And what is interesting is that Trump has not said absolutely anything about the situation in Mexico. There are no positions regarding, violations of human rights or the attacks on democratic institutions. And this is, in my view, weakening even more Mexico as a country, as a society, as an economy. So my question, and I cannot answer this question, either is what will be the U.S. main interest in Mexico in the next 25 years? Stopping Central American immigration, controlling violence and organized crime in Mexico, political stability, social stability, and this is really an open question. So, as long as the symmetry remains, and if we become a weaker and more vulnerable partner, I think it is a very dangerous formula to assess what the main U.S. interest in Mexico will be. So far, as I said, foreign policy is not really, a matter for discussion between the two countries, and there seems to be no interest in the U.S. in what is going on in Mexico. So probably, if the relationship changes, we will have to imagine new interests and new ways of relating to each other, which is no longer stability in Mexico. Perhaps we will have a more fragmented relationship, immigration, violence, probably human rights, economics, investment, and not like a general view of the bilateral relationship as we had in the past. And I think I'll just leave it there because probably, as I said, Jorge will explore more on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Before I cede the microphone to Lucas Macmillan, who will speak next, I invite all of you who have joined us today to submit your questions through the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. I see questions are coming in already, so I will come back to them after Lucas Macmillan and Jorge Schiavone are done with their presentations. Lucas, please.
Thank you very much. Jorge Schiavone and I focused on the role of sub-state actors, and that is U.S. states and Mexican states, in how they shape this binational relationship. And so what I want to do is tell everyone 5 things to know about the context of how U.S. states and Mexican states shape relationships, and then say a word about our conclusions, and then I'll turn it over to my co-author. The first thing to know is that U.S. and Mexican states have been actively engaging one another and their national officials for decades. When we think about these activities, I'm talking about travels by governors and other officials. I'm talking about the formation of overseas offices that promote exports, that attract investment, that promote tourism, and that seek to serve the migrant communities abroad in the case of the Mexican states. I'm talking about the signing of agreements that U.S. and Mexican states or their localities put together. And I'm talking about the creation of institutions. And these are institutions that the Mexican states and the U.S. states have put together in their own institutional apparatus, or these are the institutions that they have put together in a binational fashion. So here we mean the Border Legislative Conference, the Border Governors Conference, or the U.S. Mexico Border Mayors Association. And all of this means that U.S. and Mexican states are increasing their interaction with NGOs and with international institutions, or IGOs. So all of those 5 ways are examples of what scholars would call paradiplomacy. And so scholars believe paradiplomacy is best defined as engagement in foreign relations activities by sub-state or subnational authorities. And when we think about this, we think about all of the things that the Mexican and U.S. states are doing, but as I hinted at, now we have their localities doing these things, because globalization has meant that the cost of doing these things has lessened over time. And we should be clear to say that both U.S. and Mexican states have pushed constitutional limitations, that they have pushed against what they are supposed to stay away from, which is the foreign policy powers being only given to the national government. It means that they've taken advantage of loopholes and they've pushed against these constitutional limitations. So overall, paradiplomacy is present and increasing. Number 2 is that governors of Mexican and U.S. states have become leaders in promoting their own interest. And here I mean ambassadors, and here I mean spokespersons. And so with a globalized world, a world that has had economic, social, and political effects, governors have been able to differentiate their own political units, and they have been able to differentiate their own political priorities. And so we see variation for what one U.S. state does to another, or what one Mexican state would prioritize over another. So ambassadors and spokespersons certainly has enabled governors in their international ambition. The third thing is that Mexican and U.S. states are incredibly tied to one another. In economic terms, this explains why Mexico is the top U.S. trading partner of 2020. When we were looking at our analysis, we saw that 45 of the 50 U.S. states had an increase in trade from 1999 to 2017. And so overwhelmingly, 36 and 38 states have Mexico as the top importer of goods or exporter of goods. This is a huge economic relationship. So even though we may hear legislatures and governors talk about the environment and energy and the border and security, culture, human rights, and education, the mainstay of the relationship is economics. Yes, foreign investment is big, tourism promotion is big, but trade dwarfs everything. And so trade drives the relationship. Fourthly, we looked at variables like the number of overseas offices, the number of institutional agreements that Jorge will speak about. But we found that even though you might think that geography would be a variable that would matter the most, instead it's really economic size and population. And this means that a Mexican state like Jalisco, or a California or a Texas in the United States, these are the main subnational units that are participating in paradiplomacy. And again, it's because economics seems to drive the relationship. The last thing to know is that as we go to the future, we're going to be looking at more global cities. And so it's not just US and Mexican states, it's now Guadalajara, Los Angeles, and many other cities whose mayors are forming their own institutions and getting involved in being those ambassadors for their constituents. And so let me end with saying a little bit about our conclusion. Our conclusion is, much as Dr. Smith would say, much more continuity than change. And that continuity is that we see an expected future that is still very much centered on trade. We may see nationalistic, isolationist rhetoric from national leaders such as AMLO and Trump. We may see others embracing border security, human rights, environment, and energy issues. But instead, at the end of the day, it's the collaboration and cooperation on economics that will come to guide the system. And that is because the US and Mexican governors know this, and this is in the long-term reality of usefulness to their constituents. Their constituents don't just need good supply lines for the grocery store, they need the stability of jobs. And so we find that the continuity will be there. It's also important to realize that although we might not hear this rhetoric is there in the back rooms of lobbying. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one of the biggest lobbying agents on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And so we don't see as many traditional or Chamber of Commerce Republicans saying as much these days. Perhaps they're somewhat muzzled. And we don't see as many moderate Democrats or even traditional Democrats saying as much on trade, because the Democratic Party has long been skeptical of trade. But what we find is that all of this paradiplomacy has set up networks. It has helped to institutionalize relationships. And so whether we're talking about chambers of commerce, business councils, non-governmental actors of all sorts at the subnational level, local level, all of this means that for the relationship to thrive, it will focus on economics and particularly trade. And I might add, the U.S. antipathy for China, at least in the next couple of years, may be a help to U.S. and Mexican relations as we seek to look at all the ways in which we're tied together. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Jorge, straight out. Questions are coming in, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. So Jorge, you're next.
I was trying to unmute my microphone. Well, thank you first for the invitation to participate in this book. And most important, thank you for finally including paradiplomacy to better understand the U.S.-Mexico relationship. As we all know, and we just heard from Dr. Smith and Dr. Covarrubias, the U.S.-Mexico relationship is so complex, and it's impossible to understand it just by analyzing the relation between the presidents or even of the federal governments. What we've seen is that all politics are local politics in the US, and also in terms of international affairs, it is very important to understand the relation between subnational governments, between the US and Mexico, to understand better the construction of the infrastructure to administer the bilateral relations. We've been working for this in the course of the last 20 years, so I sincerely want to thank you, Tony, and the other two great editors of this book, Alfonso Lopez de la Osa and our friend from CIDE, Jesus Velasco, for finally understanding that we have to also include subnational governments to better understand the bilateral relation. What I'll try to do in the course of the next 5 minutes is provide the empirical evidence to sustain the 5 conclusions that my brilliant co-author has already presented. And what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit how paradiplomacy has evolved in the course of the last 20 years and where we might see it going in the course of the next 25 years. Something interesting to know is that paradiplomacy has grown 95% in the course of the last 15 years in the measures that we have in our paper. That means that approximately it grows at a rate of 30% every 5 years. And as Professor Smith was saying, we also expect continuity in this sense. And therefore, what we will see probably in the course of the next 25 years is that every 5 years, it will continue growing at a rate of approximately 30%. So it means that we'll have more and more diplomacy, and it will become increasingly important in the case of the two countries. Also, something that we were able to measure for the first time is how important the mechanisms for international cooperation between Mexican and U.S. subnational governments is also increasing. And what we were able to do is construct a database which includes the 1,094 interinstitutional agreements that exist between Mexican subnational governments and their counterparts around the world. Well, what's interesting to see is that the Mexican foreign diplomacy is very similar to Mexican foreign policy in the sense that it is concentrated in the Americas, and more specifically with the United States. Of all these 1,094 interinstitutional agreements, 24.95% are just with one partner, the US. And we have approximately some other 20% with other Latin American countries. So once again, Mexican foreign policy is concentrated in the Americas. Well, Mexican paradiplomacy is also concentrated in the Americas, and our most important partner for Mexican subnational governments is the United States. Also, something interesting to note is how this paradiplomacy is divided amongst Mexican subnational governments. And what we see is that, once again, Mexican paradiplomacy is very similar to the distribution of income in Mexico. What do I mean by this? That 1/3 of the states concentrate 2/3 of all international activity of subnational governments. So it is only states like Jalisco, Estado de Mexico, Chiapas, Nuevo León, and these states concentrate approximately 1/3 of the states, the biggest ones and the ones with more population, and those which are in the border concentrate approximately 2/3 of all diplomatic activity of Mexican subnational governments. So yes, there's a concentration on the Mexican side, but there's also a concentration on the US side. And what we see is that the 4 border states, that is California, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, concentrate 70% of all paradiplomacy between the US and Mexico. So what we see, and 20 states in the US from the 50 US states have no interinstitutional agreements with Mexico. So once again, we see this very asymmetric distribution of paradiplomacy between US and Mexican states. Also, what's interesting to note is that from this distribution of the relationship between the US and Mexican states, we see a concentration in specifically 2 states, which are Texas and California. Texas concentrates 30%, California 15%, New Mexico 9%, and Arizona 12% of all interinstitutional, and that is approximately 2/3 of all US activity through paradiplomatic activity of U.S. states with Mexico. We concentrate amongst this 4 states. Also, what we see is how it has grown in the course of the last 25 years. And more specifically, what we see is that it had a trend which was growing exponentially between the decades of 2000 and the first part of the decade of the 2010s. And in the last 5 years, it has reached a level in which it started to reduce its activity proportionally in the last 5 years, but it is still growing. Now, what are the areas of cooperation between Mexican and U.S. national governments? Well, exactly those areas in which they have the powers to do so, according both to the U.S. and the Mexican Constitution. So we shouldn't be surprised that the vast majority of the interinstitutional agreements between Mexico and the U.S. are concentrated in trade promotion, promotion of investment, education, culture, promotion of tourism, and also the environment. So it is those areas in which subnational governments have the powers to actually have international cooperation, in which we see more intense cooperation amongst US and Mexican subnational governments. And finally, what should we expect for the course of the next 25 years. If the same rate of cooperation that we have seen maintains itself in the course of the next 25 years, what we would expect is that parallel diplomacy between Mexican and U.S. subnational governments will increase at a pace of somewhere between 20 to 30% in the course of the next every 5 years in the course of the next 20 to 25 years. And therefore, we would expect to have somewhere between 350 interinstitutional agreements by year 2025, 430 by year 2030, 613 by year 2040, and approximately 880 by year 2050. So it means that the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, especially when things get complicated at the federal level, will be definitely the relations between Mexican and U.S. subnational governments, which have the incentives and which have the interest to continue this very profitable relation for both U.S. and Mexican states to guarantee the welfare of their local societies and their local economies. And finally, we close our paper giving 10 recommendations on how to increase the governance of parallel diplomacy between Mexico and the U.S., but I won't go into them, just to make sure that those who are listening to us are interested not only in reading our chapter, but also of buying this wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Let's see. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge, for that presentation. We have a number of questions, so I'm very appreciative of the fact that Peter stayed with us. So I'm going to try to do kind of a rapid fire. If you guys unmute your microphone, so we can do a kind of a rapid fire Q&A real quick. And let me see. There is a question specifically about Biden's, and I'd like to address that question to Peter. You briefly mentioned some possible changes under a Biden administration as a result of López Obrador's ties, at least implicit ties, to Trump. Can you elaborate a little bit more what the bilateral relationship would look like under a Biden-López Obrador presidency? Well, presidencies, really. Can you unpack that for us in a minute or two? Yes, Peter?
I'm sorry, are you waiting for me?
Yeah. It's about the Biden, what the pair, if Biden wins the election, what would the relationship look like under a Biden-AMLO pair? What would you expect it to be? Can you unpack that a little more?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is López Obrador is going to have to change his discourse in a hurry and make some gestures toward the United States and toward incoming President Biden that might at least cover up some of the difficulties that are obviously going to follow on the wake of this relationship. Let me make a second point. I think we need to distinguish between Trump and Trumpism. Let us imagine that Donald Trump disappears from the political field per se, although he might continue in some way as a vocal provocateur within the U.S. political arena. But he has followers. And the Trump movement, I think, is a real movement. And it's got, 40% of the population, more or less, behind it. So whatever happens with Donald Trump, it's not clear to me that Trumpism is going to dissipate. And it's clear to me that a lot of ambitious politicians on the American right are seeking advantage within that kind of Trumpist kind of outlook. Now, the last thing I want to say, we've been talking from time to time about policy or foreign policy. There is no policy in the Trump administration. There's no policy of any kind. There's especially no foreign policy. There's a kind of urge in the domestic arena, but I think Donald Trump would just as soon forget the rest of the world if he could, and focus on his domestic arrangements. It's ironic in a sense that Lopez Obrador has a somewhat similar view that one way to read his alignment with Trump is that he wanted to make sure the United States would get out of Mexican politics so that he could pursue his own domestic agenda, which, if we take it at face value, calls for substantial rearrangement of the social structure within Mexico, and that one way he could sort of try to get flexibility to do that would be to take the United States out of play. And the way to take the United States out of play was to get Trump out of play, or to neutralize Trump. So these are, complicated matters. I give up here. I just want to mention the wall, the discourse about the wall. For so long, it's been a major theme in the Trump presidency. It's gotten much less attention in the last year or so, but it does represent a very primitive form of isolationism within the United States. I mean, it's really medieval in its conceptual structure, but nonetheless, it's there and it exists. And I don't think even President Biden is going to be able to make that go away. I mean, I don't think he's going to follow it, but nonetheless, it's going to continue. Trump may or may not disappear, but Trumpism will not.
Jorge, and then Anna. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wrote an open piece on this question. What happens if Biden wins in the U.S. Mexico relationship? So I will concentrate my answer exclusively in terms of migration. Biden has to demonstrate that he cares about migration control, especially at the border. So what we will see most probably is a dramatic change in migration policy with the Biden administration, which looks very similar to what we saw during the Obama administration. That is, migration control will take place at the border, which means that deportations will mostly be done at those people who are trying to cross the border. And what we will see is a reduction in deportations from inside the United States. And that is a wonderful news for Mexico, because the vast majority of our of Mexican nationals are already very well included into U.S. society. 40% of them have been there for over 10 years. 40% of them have been over 5 years. That means that only 20% have been less than 5 years. They have mortgages. They have binational families. Sometimes they have mixed families in the sense that they're married to a U.S. citizen and have a U.S. citizen as children, but they're not. So it will be very good in the sense that there will be a huge reduction in terms of deportations from inside the U.S. And another very important change will be in terms of DACA. I guess the Biden administration will use its political power to find a legislative solution for the DACA beneficiaries. And if you know, approximately 78% of the 700 DACA recipients are Mexicans. That is approximately 500,000 Mexicans. Therefore, it will also be extremely good for Mexico. There's two very small changes in terms of the U.S. migration policy. However, we will see stricter control at the border, but that's not very good news for Mexico because, as you know, Mexican migration has been going down, and actually U.S. Mexico migration is since year 2010 net zero, which means that more Mexicans are coming back to Mexico than those that are going to the U.S.
Anna?
Thank you very much, Tony. Very much in the same logic as Peter. If Biden tries to make the U.S. again a liberal leader in the world, then that may have some consequences in terms of U.S. and Mexico's foreign policies. We might have disagreements if Mexico does not join U.S. foreign policies very much in the liberal agenda, human rights, democracy, etc. And in the same sense, we might also see a recovery of this liberal agenda, which might again have consequences inside Mexico because of violation of human rights, because of violence in general, because of the weakness of Mexico's democratic institutions. So we might have perhaps some conflict, and not necessarily because López Obrador bet for Trump, but because the interests and the agenda of Biden might be very different. And of course, I think we will have a very close, a very strong enforcement of USMCA. That means the US will take very seriously the role of, overseeing that Mexico is complying with the treaty and complying with all the social and labor clauses within the treaty. So that might also be a source of conflict. So probably we're not predicting a better relationship if Biden wins the presidency. Thank you.
I'll take a couple of the questions and sub questions that are coming in and ask something very specific. And we'll start with Lucas and go around. One of the greatest challenges that I think has the potential to determine the U.S. Mexico relationship in the future is the rule of law in Mexico. If Mexico ends up as a lawless, more chaotic, more violent, poorer, more difficult country to deal with, something a little closer along the spectrum to a state that is kind of failing, a social contract that is failing, it'll be very difficult for any president to really shore up American public opinion for a deeper integration with Mexico. Where do you expect that? Can the United States, Canada perhaps, together with the United States, help Mexico redo its rule of law institutions so that it's easier to sell the partnership at home in the United States, in the public, because if Mexico is more chaotic, perhaps the American public will want that wall and will want that separation because they'll just simply say Mexico is, as the ancient Romans said, ubi leones, right? It's the Wild West. It's impossible to have a partnership with a country like that. Lucas, what do you think about that set of questions that are coming in?
Well, I'm worried about that. And the reason I'm so worried about that is because the United States is having its own problems with the rule of law. And the United States, under Donald Trump, has so disparaged institutions. And so my worry is that in the U.S., certainly the Trump administration has succeeded in appointing federal judges, but in terms of the courts, they have not worked as well. And the president has been heard to say that he disparages individual judges and the judicial branch in general. And so it would be difficult, I think, for the United States to be of a big help to Mexico in terms of courts and judicial process and the criminal justice system, particularly given all that we've experienced in 2020, which is a giant wake-up call. I will say, however, that you do have places in the United States that have sought to be more careful about how the U.S. Mexico relationship is understood. And certainly you may have some degree of commonality between a business community that wants economic stability and political actors that want economic stability that could seek to deal with some of these destabilizing effects. But as others have said, the nationalization of the media and everybody staying home and watching too much TV has perhaps hurt the ability of more moderate voices, more solution-oriented voices that would come. So I'm not very optimistic.
Anybody else? Ana, you want to chime in on this? Peter, you want to chime in?
No, I think these comments have been very precise and very insightful, and I appreciate them. So, are we heading for an end, or we got more questions coming?
We got just a couple more questions. I wanna address the economic issue, but I wanted to address the rule of law, because there are several questions that are concerned about the rule of law, and I think that the more Mexico is sold as a failed state, a chaotic state, the more difficult will be for American politicians who are more moderate, like Biden, to make the case that Mexico is worth integrating into North America. And I think it'll affect the ability of these politicians to do their political and diplomatic work in the future.
To follow up, the rule of law is obviously essential. In the United States, it has been challenged very much by the current administration, and probably before that by other administrations as well. The positive sign is that the legal community has kind of consolidated a position that is pretty progressive and pretty defensible. That doesn't mean that Trump has not been unable to appoint judges who don't hold that view. But I think the body of the legal community in the United States is quite strong in its defense of the rule of law, and that one kind of cooperation that might be really useful would be between legal communities in Mexico and the United States. It's not that we will teach them how to run the law, etc., but there are things to learn on both sides. And I think that in general, everybody has an interest in the functional rule of law.
Yeah. Let me ask two questions to kind of begin to wrap up our session. The first is, China has become an undeniable political and diplomatic player in North America. It was so. It was the so-called uninvited partner of the North American Free Trade Agreement, with a very deep impact in North American economic integration. What do you expect China's role to be in the next 5, 10, 20 years in North America? Ultimately, in the U.S., there's an emerging struggle for geopolitical power. What role does Mexico play? How is China going to affect the binational relationship? Where are the opportunities, and where are the potential issues that may emerge as China again asserts itself as an uninvited player in North America? Anybody? Anna?
No, Jorge.
Jorge, please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, this trade war between the United States and China has benefited Mexico to some extent, in the sense that we are now the U.S.'s first trading partner, mostly as a result of the measures that the Trump administration has taken against China. And Mexico understands very well where its priorities are in terms of trade and in terms of investment, and it knows that its concentration in North America, and specifically the U.S., where it should try to continue building infrastructure to manage the relationship. That means that Mexico is very, very careful in terms of what it does vis-a-vis China. For example, if you compare Chinese investment in Latin America, what you will see is that Chinese investment in Mexico proportionally is very low compared to practically every other country in Latin America. And the other thing is, as we all know, that one of the clauses within the new UMSCA treaty is that you cannot sign an agreement with a non-market economy, because that means that you would be pushed out of NAFTA, of North American integration. Therefore, Mexico understands very well that it has to go very smoothly and very carefully in its relations with China, vis-a-vis not to complicate its relations with the US. I've always said, and I've written this so many times, I've learned it from my professor, Peter Smith, that Mexican foreign policy is a triangular foreign policy. It means that when Mexico thinks about its relation with any other country in the world, especially, for example, China, it will always see what its impact and effect is with its relation with the United States. That's how important the U.S. is for Mexican foreign policy, and that's why it's always a triangular foreign policy which sees effects of any other relationship vis-a-vis the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
Peter, let me turn on your microphone if you can help us there. Laura? Peter's microphone. There you go. Peter, go ahead.
Okay, no, I just wanted to comment on the role of international institutions and why they're so difficult. In my view, generally, weaker partners in a relationship seek institutions that will embody rules. Stronger countries don't like institutions, right? They don't want anyone to set down rules that they have to obey. So this, we've seen this historically in a number of situations, and I would simply say, to add to that, I think the country that I know most that is most concerned about its sovereignty is, guess what? The United States. We are very concerned. I mean, we used to laugh at Latin Americans because they were so concerned about soberanía. Not now. I mean, and not in the past either, right? The generals in NATO, guess what? All have to be Americans, etc. So the tension between institutionalization and sovereignty, I think, is very real, and it appears in this relationship, and it appears in ideas to give, for example, what used to be NAFTA. I've forgotten its current name. It's kind of an institutional governing body. Well, guess who really doesn't want that is the United States, because the United States wants to be able to exercise its power in an unfettered way. And this is not only within this relationship. I mean, to me, it's kind of one of the insights about world politics. But that's where we are, where maybe we would think that it's basically good for all partners to institutionalize, but for the strongest ones, it's not, because they feel that they're giving up power in a zero-sum game. And we could debate the academic, qualities of this debate, but nonetheless, that's what happens. So I'm not very optimistic that institutionalization, either of the bilateral relationship or what used to be the NAFTA group with Canada, is really going to go very far. The United States will not stand for it.
Great. I'm going to start closing. We didn't discuss in the book, the original book, The Future of U.S. Mexico Relations, we did not discuss the COVID problem, because obviously it was conceived in the spring of 2018, 2 years ago, and then the chapters were ready more than 6 months ago. Producing a book is very takes a long time, takes months. So your final remarks, and if you can, a sentence or two in closing about how this pandemic has affected the political and diplomatic relationship between the two countries. Why don't we start with Jorge and then go around and finish with Dr. Smith. Jorge.
It is one more issue within this very complex bilateral relationship. I think it has had a huge effect, especially at the border level with the closing of the border. However, it hasn't had that much of an effect yet in trade and investment. There are other variables which explain how trade and investment is taking place. COVID is not one of them.
Thank you. Lucas?
Well, I think that COVID has reminded a lot of people about the importance of supply lines. So I'm very interested to see if the business community is going to rethink some of its much longer supply lines, and the unreliability of partners in China to be able to bring a product to the market. I think that could be an opening for Mexico in some ways, or the Canadians, as we have a tighter economic integration. But I think one of the things clearly that COVID will continue to affect, at least for the next year, is the migration debate. And when we think about how people move and what they do, and then I think there's already being discussions about how COVID will affect the new ways that we continue to think about securitization. So that could reshape the relationship in some way.
Thank you, Lucas. Ana?
Yes, thank you. Well, I completely agree with what Lucas and Jorge have said. I think so far it has not really have an impact in the bilateral relationship as such, except for immigration and trade. And I would only end up saying, well, we have yet another similarity between Trump and López Obrador, which is not believing very much in the danger of the situation and not relying very much on science, which I think in a way has allowed them to understand each other better. It has consequences in the sense that the bilateral relationship is going fine, but on the other hand, it has very, very negative consequences within our countries. Thank you.
Peter, yours is the last word.
The last word, well, it is simply this. We should not think of this relationship as a zero-sum game. In my view, it's a positive-sum game, or should be a positive-sum game. That is, what's good for Mexico benefits the United States. What could we want more than a stable, strong, democratic, prosperous partner on our border? You know, with over 100 million people. I mean, isn't that in our interest to have that kind of neighborhood? And that spreads its influence also, at least through Central America and other parts of the region, and an example in other parts of the world. So in my view, just quite simply, it is a positive-sum game, but we have to play it as a positive-sum game. If we play it as a zero-sum game, then we're never going to win. If we play it as a negative-sum game, then we've lost before we even start. But if it is construed as a positive-sum game, that kind of releases the pressure on some of the decisions that need to be made, and sort of allows the United States, together with Mexico, to think of creating a kind of mutually beneficial neighborhood. That seems to me to be good for us as well as good for Mexico.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, The Future of the U.S. Mexico Relations, Strategic Foresight, is a book available by Arte Público Press at the University of Houston. And I want to finish by thanking our partners in this big project. Of course, the TEC de Monterrey, the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León, Universidad Iberoamericana, the Mexico Foods Texas Mexico Center at SMU in Dallas, the University of Houston, its Law Center, and of course, us at the Center for the United States and Mexico. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ana. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you for this opportunity to join your project, to meet some of you, and to see friends in addition. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Bye.